So let me first welcome everyone again. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Rosa Andrews, and I'm an outreach coordinator at NAMI Miami-Dade. Today we have a very exciting speaker meeting as the expert about toxic stress and cardiovascular disease with Dr. Roger McIntosh. He's an associate professor at the University of Miami with the Department of Psychology, Divisions of Health, Cognitive and Behavioral Neuroscience. Dr. McIntosh's work broadly examines psychosocial risk factors associated with accelerated cerebrovascular and cardiovascular disease. His work focuses on high stress as well as immunocompromised individuals, such as persons living with the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. He's the director of the Brain Resilience Embodiment, Affect, and Translation Health, BREATH, lab, and Dr. McIntosh utilized functional magnetic resonance imaging and other psychophysiological data collection techniques in order to measure individual responses to psychological stress in his laboratory and natural environment. Dr. McIntosh is funded by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute to study the effects of stigma and discrimination on cardiovascular and coronary disease. With that, I will leave you with Dr. McIntosh. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Perfect. So good evening, everyone. My name is Roger McIntosh. As Rosa mentioned, I'm an associate professor of health psychology and cognitive and behavioral neuroscience at the University of Miami. And I'm here this evening to speak to you all regarding toxic stress, racism, violence, and trauma, and how these factors, interwoven factors, lead to cardiovascular disease and impede cardiovascular health. So briefly, in terms of the learning objectives for this evening, I wanted to discuss some health disparities and key risk factors in select populations that are exposed to elevated levels of stress, whether this be traumatic stress, racial stress, or violence in a form of stress. Next, I want to talk about how stress affects the actual body. Ultimately, I want to connect these psychological processes in the mind to these physiological outcomes in the body with a specific focus on cardiovascular disease outcomes. As we all know, cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of mortality in our nation, and it's definitely something to be reckoned with, and it's about time that many individuals in mental health believe that we begin reckoning with it, that is from the neck up. Specifically, as we discuss toxic stressors, we'll be discussing them from varying levels. So how stress can be internalized, how stress can take form in terms of interpersonal stressors, institutional stress, structural stress, as well as stress from the environment, and ultimately how these different sources of stress lead to these pathophysiological mechanisms that relate ultimately to poor cardiovascular outcomes. And then at the end, I'm going to try to bring a bit of hope to the discussion and discuss not just the forms of risk, but also resilience to stress, trauma, racism, and violence, and how we can basically formulate that resilience at these different levels. And these different levels, again, will be sort of reverberated throughout the course of the talk. Before I jump into things, maybe a little bit more about my background. So I initially began my research looking at the way the brain works in terms of regulating emotions and regulating affect. So I didn't jump headfirst into stress, nor did I jump into stress in terms of traumatic stress or racialized stress initially. What I was initially most importantly focused on was how the brain is in a position to regulate the negative affect that we experience. And then after studying emotion regulation in the brain, we realized that when those processes in terms of being able to regulate one's emotions break down, that's when you begin to see this report of perceived psychological stress. Now, most of my work took place in individuals living with HIV, and with HIV, because there's a lot of intersectional stress, whether it be because of health status, sexual minority status, or race and ethnicity, you found that individuals with HIV experience not only elevated levels of psychological stress, but today, in this day, the actual number one cause of mortality in individuals living with HIV is not AIDS, but rather cardiovascular disease, specifically heart failure. So this is just a sort of a microcosm for what we see for all walks of life. And what I'll do is I'll again try to explain how these stress processes are most vulnerable for certain individuals in our communities. So one of the areas that I initially began looking at was the effect of post-traumatic stress, specifically in HIV positive women. HIV positive women report levels of post-traumatic stress at 2 to 3 times the clip of HIV negative women. But we also observed that in this population of HIV positive women who experience trauma, there's a high incidence of interpartner violence and sexual violence. And not only that, we observed, and this study will demonstrate, that there are elevated risks for hypertension, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and combined cardiovascular disease in women who have been exposed to sexual violence. Now, it's important to realize that we're not just talking about trauma. Specifically, traumatic stress is going to reverberate, like I mentioned before, and leave behind sort of a trail of affective changes. So shame, fear, guilt, blame, these are oftentimes what is the residual effect of post-traumatic stress or many, many forms of trauma. And it's important to understand that this trauma can interact at different levels. So there are sources for traumatic stress that come outside of this internalized locus that individuals are faced with. The trauma can come from interpersonal relationships, such as domestic violence, intimate partner violence. The trauma can come from adverse childhood experiences. The trauma can come from institutional stressors, such as incarceration, immigration stress, what we see in the media, policies. And there's even a greater legacy effect in terms of displacement, genocide, colonization, and slavery, which ultimately allow individuals to harness these traumatic thoughts, these traumatic emotions. And the longer those thoughts and emotions are harnessed, the greater it appears there are risks for developing cardiovascular disease. Now let's talk a little bit more about the risk and really get into these special populations. So when you look at cardiovascular disease risk, there are several real plain sight disparities which can be observed when you compare Blacks with whites. When it comes to diabetes, for instance, Blacks have greater hospitalization rates. They have glycemia, which is not as well controlled as their white counterparts. Same thing for cholesterol, and they have blood pressure, which is oftentimes uncontrolled. All right. Now, what is the ultimate source of this? Well, there's other examples. For instance, if you look at hypertension prevalence as a function of sex, race, and ethnicity, if you compare levels of hypertension for men and women who are non-Hispanic Black compared to non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic Asians, and Hispanics, you'll see significantly higher levels of hypertension prevalence across the board. And this is data from the National Center of Health Statistics, a bit dated, but these trends definitely are still current today. It's not just diabetes and hypertension. We also have greater risk for stroke. So specifically, individuals who not necessarily are African American per se, but we know that there is an elevated risk for heart attacks, strokes, and blood pressure in individuals who experience significant or serious stressful life events. And now you can see on the x-axis that the risk is anywhere between 1.5 to almost over 2 times greater risk when it comes to hypertension for individuals who've experienced stressful events. So now we're thinking about the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender, along with the experience of stress and trauma in the environment. Now, this is a very, very interesting set of data, and it basically stratifies hypertension rates by race or ethnicity. First, what you see here is individuals who have not experienced discrimination. So there's several scales that get at everyday discrimination. And typically individuals are either reporting that they do experience discriminative stress or that they do not experience it, okay? And what we find is that if you compare the rates in terms of hypertension, and this is the number of diagnoses per 100 person years, you compare them for individuals who do not versus do report elevated levels of stress, you'll find that there's significantly greater hypertension, specifically for Blacks, which you see at the very, very bottom in orange. So those dots are estimates, and the estimates for those that are not experiencing everyday discrimination or discrimination stress is about 6.5, and that leaps up to about a little over 8 for Black individuals. And this disparity is stronger for Black Americans compared to Hispanics, whites, and Asian Americans. Okay. Now, what is actual stress? What are we really talking about here? So in terms of a definition, stress can be described as a perceived discrepancy between physical or psychological demands of a situation and the appraisal of the resources that you have at your disposal. So this is really getting at a psychological phenomenon. You can have two individuals in the same exact situation, and one individual report significantly lower levels of psychological stress simply because they perceive that they have greater amount of resources. Now, what typically are those resources? We talk about biological, psychological, or social resources. I want you all to think back to sort of our early evolution, right? As we were sort of making our way and developing ourselves in terms of societies, and we found that there were certain sources of stress that were eminent in terms of our environment. So there were, for instance, dangerous animals. Sometimes it can be a warring tribe. So other people oftentimes are sources of stress. Now, sometimes the stress doesn't come from the alien per se, but within your own group, being ostracized, whether it be because of health issues or reproductive issues, et cetera, et cetera. But being socially ostracized from a group is a very, very, very strong experience in terms of psychological stress. There's hunger, there's cold. Now, we think about hunger these days, not too many folks go hungry comparatively to those in the past, but we do have this experience of delays in terms of the infrastructure and getting resources, particularly food in our plate when that's necessary. And then we also have this brain of ours, which for eons has been perceiving these types of situations in our environment, all right? Social exclusion, having limited levels of resources. And typically in these situations, it's a time for action, right? And when a perception of psychological stress occurs, what that will do is it will ramp up activity inside the body to prepare the individual to deal with that threat, to deal with that stressor. So if there's a dangerous animal, you might have to evade that predator. If there are other tribes that are warring with you and you're under attack, you're going to have to defend yourself. If you're socially excluded, you're going to have to, instead of depending upon others for resources, depend upon yourself for those resources. And same thing for hunger. We see animals in the animal kingdom every single day. When it's hungry or when there's time for hunger, it's time for them to begin foraging. So essentially, there needs to be, the body needs to prepare itself to deal with this adversity. And the two domains, the two systems which tend to receive the greatest amount of preparatory activation or resources are the immune system and the cardiovascular system. Okay. Now, why would we need this cardiovascular system? Well, that makes sense. You know, we have the fight versus the flight response. But then the immune system, what's so important about the immune system? Well, if we think back to these dangerous animals that we might have been exposed to, or anyways, these animals that were in our environment at the time when we were developing this central nervous system, that we may survive the initial attack, maybe a scratch or a bite. You may survive that wound. It might not be mortal, but what you will not survive in a time without penicillin and without antibiotics is you're not going to survive an infected wound. So henceforth, when the body, from an evolutionary standpoint, the perception of stress has always led to a ramping up of the immune system, particularly the innate immune cells, the ones that are simply moving through our circulation, waiting to pounce upon a bacteria, protozoan, or virus which has invaded into the system. Now, we talk about what the stress response is. Now, the stress response is what I just described. You're reprioritizing the body's resources, specifically the immune system and the cardiovascular system. So no time to digest your food, no time to sleep. This is what needs to occur. Now, this is a very, very energy dependent process. And sometimes when we discuss stress in the literature, you'll hear this term called weathering. And this weathering effect occurs based upon this constant, continuous allocation of resources. We define this as allostasis, to make sure that the body, the systems itself are prepared for action. Now, importantly, when I mention cardiovascular system, I'm not just talking about your heart rate going up. I'm talking about energy in and of itself. So the fuel that we typically need is glucose, and I'll get back to that in just a moment. But ultimately, if you sort of break down what's happening inside the brain before we have this physiological response to stress, well, it's a number of factors. So there's going to be individual differences in vulnerability based on your genetic predisposition, how you grew up, and your prior experiences. If you take into consideration not just the acute psychological or physiological stressor, but other chronic social environmental stressors. And oftentimes those stressors come with unavailability of resources, right? There's also major life events, trauma, death, divorce, abuse, being dislocated from one's families, etc. So at any point in time, we're not only just dealing with the acute stressor, but this excess additional baggage which we've been exposed to. And if you start to think about the populations which are most predisposed to cardiovascular disease as a function of traumatic stress, it's typically individuals who carry around with them this additional baggage, right? These additional factors, psychological factors, which are processed concurrently with the immediate threat. In any event, this allostatic load isn't always the case. Sometimes folks are really able to do well and adapt to their stressful situations. But on the flip side of that, and particularly over time, you're going to find that there's going to be a greater emphasis on allostatic processes compared to adaptation. Basically, the body, the systems will weather down over time, and then certain systems will bear the blunt of that weathering. All right, it might be the gastrointestinal system for some. Others, it might be a weak immune system. For some, it might be a weak cardiovascular system. So what I found in our research and our work is that stress is going to have an effect on multiple systems of the body. We have studies right now which are comparing stress processes to gastrointestinal disorders, all the way to coronary artery disease and heart failure. So it's really across the board. But again, we're just going to focus on cardiovascular disease for the sake of this talk. Okay. Now, getting back to kind of making it a bit more basic, we have this alarm that goes off in our minds, indicating that there's a threat in our environment. We experience this anxiety, and then it's going to activate our neuroendocrine system. The stress hormones in our body are going to become active. And then as a result of that, we're going to see that the body is going to experience systematic changes. Now, these stress hormones are very important because they carry the signature of the brain to the rest of the physiology. It's easy for the brain to communicate with itself because it uses neurons, but there are no neurons, at least to the extent of the central nervous system, in the rest of the body. So the only way that the mind can prepare the body for action or to prepare it for any incurring threat or stressor is to use these stress hormones. Now, as I mentioned before, these stress hormones have various effects, systematic effects throughout the body. One of these stress hormones, which many of us are familiar with, is cortisol. Now, interestingly enough, cortisol has several negative impacts, which can all impact the cardiovascular system. So you have impaired secretion within the lower intestine, specifically the large and small intestine. So the actual secretion, the movement of the muscles, the smooth muscles within the intestines, that peristalsis stops in the exposure to cortisol, right? So when you have indigestion because you're wolfing down some food and you're stressed out because you have to get back to work, or you're watching a scary movie and your stomach is upset, you're literally slowing down the digestive processes to a halt. Something that also happens is cortisol can interact with beta cells in the pancreas, and it can increase glucagon and decrease insulin, all right? So once you decrease insulin, of course, it's going to have very negative cardiometabolic effects on the individual, which can lead ultimately to insulin resistance and low glucose uptake, meaning that you're consuming glucose, but your body is not converting that glucose properly, all right? Insulin resistance can lead to gluconeogenesis. Visceral adiposity is something which has been associated with elevated levels of stress and cortisol. But then there's also the behavioral component of stress, okay? We think about sometimes stress eating, all right? So if, for instance, you have an individual who is experiencing these elevated levels of stress, ultimately what happens is that the insulin, the pancreas, is not going to be producing sufficient amounts of insulin. Moreover, the insulin receptors are going to become resistant, okay? Now, what the individual does, or what happens to that individual, is it's going to end up starving the cells, essentially, and you will get high levels of glucose in the bloodstream and also high levels of insulin, which is going to lead to more cravings. So you are consuming food, but essentially that food that you're consuming is not getting into the cells which they belong. It's staying in the bloodstream, and you have this vicious cycle, which ultimately can result in insulin resistance. So this is just the behavioral component of psychological stress, but there are other biological processes which are important. Not to mention, when you're experiencing those stressful movies, or you're right on the edge of your seat during your favorite soccer game or football game, what comes right in between those shows or during those commercials? You see commercials for very, very high caloric food. In this day and age, the era of having food delivered right to your doorstep, like DoorDash, individuals are capitalizing upon that. And if you've watched some of the more recent statistics since the pandemic, we are seeing an increase in terms of metabolic syndrome across all ages in this country. Now, getting back to this process of the experience of stress. Now, one of the things that we've observed is that stress will get these systems triggered and going in the body. But of the types of stress that one can experience, the most salient form of stress is perhaps the stress associated with psychosocial factors, interacting with other people. And so when you look in your environment, when you look into a group of folks, you look into an elevator, you look into the line in the store, essentially you can be experiencing stress in many different ways. Sometimes there might be a social hierarchy where there might be individuals who perceive themselves, or you might perceive them as having higher social hierarchy than you. Some of my students oftentimes give me the metaphor of getting ready to step onto an elevator with 4 or 5 of your professors on at the same time. Most of those students will click send and wait for the next elevator to come along, right? There's also loneliness. Social isolation and loneliness is going to be associated with perceived psychological stress because, again, where does stress come from? The lack of the availability of perceived resources. And what's our number one resource? It's not really food. Can't really say food. Food is not going to go and build you a house or shelter. It's other people, it's other individuals. And then social threat, the threat that we get from individuals who aren't necessarily coming to us with good intentions, right? And this is where we get violence from and interpersonal other factors, okay? So what we need to think about is that socioeconomic stressors result in the largest signal of brain alarm, right? So when our sympathetic response is turned on, typically that's due to socioeconomic stressors. Sympathetic activity is going to not only increase blood sugar, but it's going to increase cardiovascular rate, but it's also going to increase inflammatory immune cells. Why? Because the brain and the body systems, more specifically, aren't able to discern whether or not that psychological stress is imagined or real, physical or psychological, whether it's ingrained in our evolution or something new like a flat tire or a Zoom interview that's not going well. And then inflammatory immune cells are going to ultimately contribute to atherosclerosis. This essentially are the 3 pillars of the work that I do. And for the most part, when looking at cardiovascular disease risk factors as it relates to psychosocial factors, many individuals are subscribing to this specific mechanism that is brain to immune to cardiovascular and leading ultimately to cardiovascular disease. So now now that we have a basic understanding of these phenomena, let's talk about the individuals who are most susceptible to these stressors, right? Trauma, violence, interpersonal stress, etc. And the question has been asked many times before, how stress impacts heart disease in persons of color. Even the anticipation of experiencing prejudice is shown to cause a cardiovascular stress response. This was a paper, one of the seminal papers that was published over a decade ago, where just the anticipation of being ostracized or treated unfairly is enough to cause your heart rate and your blood pressure to increase. Now, if we all sort of think back to 2014, the media and the television was sort of really covered by these types of stories, right? Eric Garner, for instance, and other men of color who were unarmed and who were murdered, killed by police officers. And what we find is that this experience of vicarious stress can actually be associated with cardiovascular disease, all right? So internalized stressors are the first type of stressor I'm going to talk about: overt discrimination, internalized racism, and police brutality. Now, I want to make one thing clear, right? This is not about police officers, and this is not about policing per se, but this is about when those situations which occur when an individual, an unarmed individual, particularly a person of color, is killed by the police, and that video or that event is sensationalized, whether it be for political reasons, to sell commercials or ads, or whatever the case may be. For that matter, I vividly remember one of the last times I watched CNN, which was right around this time, and I was viewing it, and on the screen, I saw an octobox. An octobox meaning 8 different screens, and in each one of those screens, they were replaying clips of unarmed Black men being gunned down in a street. Now, what I experienced just looking at that was just one occasion. What I experienced looking at that specific clip on television was enough, I can feel it in one's heart, was enough to tell me that I don't need to be exposing myself to these types of images. So it's not necessarily about the experience itself, but I want you to think about the vicarious experience of discrimination and racism. Now, the first question is, do police encounters really do increase the risk for cardiovascular disease? Now, there's a Framingham 30-year cardiovascular risk score, and this was measured in a large study. This was published actually earlier on this year. And the findings for this study, if you had to guess what the findings were, what would you say? You know, when I first saw this headline, I said, oh, I know exactly what this is going to say. Maybe there's no effects for everyone, but if you look at individuals who are racial or ethnic minorities, or maybe maybe women, for instance, that you're going to see that increased police encounters are associated with increased cardiovascular disease. They found the exact opposite, right? Specifically, actually, they found that for white individuals, there was no relationship between the encounter with police and cardiovascular disease risk. For African Americans, there was a negative association. So the more you encounter police, the lower your cardiovascular disease risk was. And this is not trying to throw itself in the face of what you expect to happen. But again, not all police encounters are bad encounters. And many would say that defunding the police, for instance, is probably not a good idea, or defunding any entity that is basically intended upon serving and protecting a particular neighborhood or environment. Nevertheless, there are some studies, and this was another study in 2022 in the Journal of Racial and Ethnic Disparities, which is down at the bottom of the screen. And what they did was they looked at over 20,000 individual encounters. So they stratified this or counted this by an individual who endorsed that they observed someone of color, unarmed or not, being murdered by police. And kind of what this person you see here is looking at their cell phone, right? So let's say something comes on Instagram, or you see something on Twitter or on Facebook, or somebody sends you a link. And so what they found was there were no effects for this exposure to lethal police encounters, no significant effects in non-Black individuals. However, if you look on the left, the average number of killings, so that there was an increased risk for stroke for Black men who observed the killings, generally speaking, as well as the unarmed killings of other Black men via some type of media content, right? For women, what was observed was the greater exposure to total killings or unarmed killings was associated with increased risk for hypertension. You see it at the right in A and B. A is for total, B is for unarmed. And then there was a trend, you can kind of see it in moving in an upward direction, for increased risk for diabetes as well. So again, not the actual experience, but the vicarious experience is enough to cause an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, as a scientist, we look at not just humans, but we also look at our furry friends, because they have immune systems and cardiovascular systems relatively similar to ours, but their lifespan, you don't have to live for 90 years as a mouse in order to see the effect of vicarious discrimination on cardiovascular risk. So this was a very interesting animal model study wherein they had mice of a particular breed observe another mouse of the same breed basically accosted by a mouse of a different breed, right? So in layman's terms, you have two black mice. You have one black mouse on the outside of a fence looking at the other black mouse being accosted by a white mouse, right? Or the mouse doesn't have to be white. It could be pink, green, yellow, whatever the case may be, right? And what they found was that it was an experience of social defeat stress was enough to cause monocytes, these innate immune cells that get sparked or spurned into action whenever there's risk for a threat in the environment. Just observing this social defeat over time, this vicarious experience of getting accosted, it was enough to have these mice have greater levels of these inflammatory immune cells begin to become trafficked to the brain as well as to the spleen. And if they're being trafficked to the brain and to the brain and the spleen, they're also going to the heart as well, okay? Specifically, there's work looking at the two types of immune cells that they saw increase were the neutrophils and the monocytes. If there are any physicians on the call, the neutrophil to monocyte or the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio or the monocyte to lymphocyte ratio are one of the very, very first tests that a physician will administer in the ER if they have someone who comes into the emergency room and they're not certain what type of trauma they've experienced. Nevertheless, when you have more of these cells floating through your circulatory system, what they end up doing, these neutrophils and monocytes, is they begin to lodge themselves in the blood vessels and they start to form what's called foam cells, okay? So these innate immune cells move away from the circulatory, or they move away from the immune system into these blood vessels, and they begin to get lodged in those blood vessels and interact with the triglycerides and the low density lipoproteins, etc. What I'm really talking about is stage 1A of arteriosclerosis, right? So the very first stage, before you get a triple bypass, the first stage that occurs is immune cells get lodged in your blood vessels and they become these blown up foam cells and they prevent the movement of blood and impede the circulatory system, okay? So again, these are internalized stressors. Nothing's even happened to you yet, just observing what's happening in someone else. Now, some of the stressors that we experience from an internalized standpoint, for the most part, are racial traumatic stressors. So racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress is characterized by chronic exposure to physical and emotional distress associated with experiencing or witnessing racism or discrimination. Now, as intuitive as this sounds, this term is probably about 5 or 6 years old, right? And so one would argue that we have been excluded from our groups. Individuals, generally speaking, humans have been excluded from their groups for years upon years upon years, eons, one would say. But it's only now, and most recently in the last decade, that we're beginning to appreciate how much this has a negative impact on our health. As I mentioned before, when I talked about trauma, there's different levels to this. And so when we discuss the internalized processes that's associated with the racial traumatic stress, right? The inferiority complex, which is developed, the invalidation, the lack of self-esteem. We know that there's interpersonal factors, so misappropriation, prejudices, and stereotypes and biases that are observed and experienced firsthand. From an institutional standpoint, embedded privileges, redlining, policies, and of course, we have this structural racial traumatic stress determinants such as capitalism, societal norms, stigma, hierarchy, right? But ultimately, it boils down to the individual. And at the level of the individual, if one does not have the adequate levels of resilience, we end up taking all of these structural, institutional, interpersonal factors and internalizing them along with whatever we're experiencing. But this is nothing new. This, again, has been a part of our genetic background since the beginning of time, being excluded from one's group. So this interpersonal racism, just again, to kind of reiterate, there's effects of prescribed discrimination on inflammation, glucocorticoids, sympathetic nervous system activity. This is going to increase allostatic load, leading to cardiovascular disease, but also we have other cardiovascular disease factors. You know, if you compare some of the statistics for women of color, Black women specifically, compared to white women, preeclampsia is 60% greater in women of color compared to non-Hispanic white women, right? And so low birth rate, these are all factors which can result in a multi-level generational effect on cardiovascular disease. So as we proceed, we'll talk and discuss a little bit more about interpersonal stressors, right? And so interpersonal stressors can come in various forms: childhood adversities, there's gang violence, there's intimate partner violence, but this is when the actual fight has come to your door, right? The trauma, the threat is actually being experienced psychologically, also physiologically by the individual. Now, the interpersonal stressors that we discussed here, they again are hardwired into our evolution, right, into our DNA. And so when we see that we are in a non-safe environment, we're being threatened by others around us, that's going to activate this sympathetic nervous system and subsequent inflammatory immune and glucocorticoid response to stress, okay? Specifically, we perceive that social threat in this interpersonal stressor and loneliness too. Now, the one in the screen, the image of the screen is, I'd like to comment on that. And gang violence is something that NAMI is definitely done some work on. And we know that in the Miami-Dade County, gang violence is definitely pervasive and has led to the loss of a lot of young life. But many times you have to take into consideration, why do individuals turn to gangs in the first place? This is all about threat and safety, all right? So if your parents are not in a position to protect you because, let's face it, a parent might be actually in the presence of their child in a conscious state for 3, 4, 5 hours in a day. So those other 19 or 18 or 12 or 10 or however many hours you're walking around Miami, you need to be able to have some sort of safety. If there is no safety, if you don't perceive safety, you have perceived threat. And unfortunately for many individuals, safety comes in the form of having a firearm at their side. Nevertheless, let's talk a bit more about social threat. Violence and cardiovascular health. I focused these images that you just saw on the younger generation, and this is the reason why. There was a systematic meta-analysis and review done about 7-8 years ago, and this showed that there was a consistent positive relationship between the experience of violence and cardiovascular outcomes in adulthood during childhood. This was a consistent relationship. So as a child, if you have more exposure to trauma or gang violence, etc., it's a greater likelihood of you being diagnosed with cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, high blood pressure, etc. Now, by contrast, if you compare adult-only violence, so individuals who might have been exposed to violence as an adult, there is an inconsistent relationship between that experience and developing cardiovascular disease. So what this is telling us is that there might be other factors that are contributing to the cardiovascular disease, but the individuals by far who are the most susceptible to the negative impacts of violence and traumatic stress on cardiovascular health are the young people, okay? And I believe it's up to us to make sure that we need to do the best that we can to ensure that they have a safe environment. In this day and age, I know when there's, my children come home discussing the most recent code black or code blue, when they have to go through drills as if there was a shooter on campus. And so this, we was really, in terms of mental health, I know a lot of times the focus is on adults, but when it comes to threat and safety, by not ensuring a safe environment psychologically for our children, we are increasing their risk. We are handing them over to these cardiovascular disease risk factors. Now, we've heard about ACEs before, adverse childhood experiences, and these are things, and I'm sorry if they're triggering, because many of us have experienced things such as divorce, and during childhood, such as divorce, maternal depression, sexual abuse, substance abuse, incarceration of a loved one, homelessness. We hear stories all the time about folks on TV who, it's amazing how they've miraculously made it from being homeless and on the street literally to doing great things in the world. And of course, the environment, right? This is not just on mom or dad or the parents, but the environment. So poverty, discrimination, poor housing, the neighborhood to which one is predisposed to living in, these can all impact these adverse childhood experiences. Now, with these adverse childhood experiences, like, what is really happening? So we end up, there's something called a fetal programming hypothesis. This is data, and I'm not showing this right now, but I just want to sort of hit this home. There are studies which suggest that the level of stress that mom experiences during her second or third trimester you can actually measure that behaviorally in the offspring. All right. So if you do a heel stick or give the child a shot, if mommy had higher levels of cortisol and higher stress in the second and third trimester, that child's going to cry longer. If mommy had those types of conditions, that child is going to be at greater risk for having emotional disorder or diagnosed with emotional disorder in a classroom. Okay. So not only do we see that, but it's actually multiple generations. And what we see is that from a genetic standpoint, right, the stress response is altering what's taking place in our DNA. And essentially, it is making the child, trying to make the child or the young individual more resilient to the stressors. You got to remember, you got to keep in mind that the body is not just going to ignore a cry for help. If you tell the body that there's a stressor or there's a threat in the environment, it's going to do what it needs to do to ensure that organism's survival. What is it going to do? Well, you'll see that individuals who've been exposed to these ACEs have high blood triglycerides and low HDLs. So these high blood triglycerides are again associated with this insulin resistance and this elevated levels of glucose and blood sugar that results from increasing the stored resources, taking that stored energy out of these fat cells and making sure that it's in the bloodstream available for you to fight or fly away. Okay. You have elevated blood pressure, you have increased adiposity, and again, these high glucose levels. So this is actually being programmed in terms of the response, the cellular response of the organism and the individual. Okay. Moreover, we observe that individuals who have had these harsh environments in childhood or even in adulthood, there are effects that occur in the immune system. Remember, I talked about the immune and the cardiovascular system are going to be going through the greatest amount of change and exposure to trauma, traumatic stress, etc. And so there's something called the leukocyte conserved transcriptional response to adversity. And without getting too deep into the woods, what this means is when you experience psychological stress or trauma, there are a set of genes which become upregulated. Now, these genes which become upregulated, guess what those genes are responsible for? They're immune cells, which are responsible for protecting against what? The bacteria, the viruses, the protozoan. We're still stuck in this evolutionarily ancient time, right? Our bodies have not, the mechanism, the communication has not changed. You're in trouble, you're under attack, let's protect you from infection. And so unfortunately, these inflammatory innate immune cells, when there's no pathogen for them to work on or attack, they begin to attack the own body. And that's where you start to see those atherosclerotic processes forming inside of the bloodstream. Okay. So again, we talk about these interpersonal violent stressors, and there is this constant interdimensional factor, which is there's internalized, interpersonal, institutional, as well as structural. And so the reasons for which an individual might be exposed to violence may not just be the result of the person that they're interacting with. All right. So even education policies and the way we treat our young people in schools today, in this sort of school to prison pipeline, we need to think about that in terms of the effects on violence and stress. But again, the reason why I put this up there is because we need to think about, even though mental health is really about the individual when it comes to treatment, in order to find true resolution for these problems, we need to think about them at these hierarchical levels, right? Structural, institutional, as well as interpersonal. So, institutional stressors, I'll give you all a couple more examples. Here we see two images of, on the left, a young child being separated from what would seem to be a loved one that is incarcerated. On the right, we see what happens with many individuals in terms of this medical apartheid or not being able to have a voice as a racial or ethnic minority, particularly for women. It's been associated actually with a lot of negative reproductive outcomes, which have been linked to discrimination, the way persons of color, particularly women, are treated in the medical setting. Nevertheless, we know that these institutional factors in terms of policies and these century-old policies specifically have caused individuals of certain predispositions, specifically women of color, to be more disproportionately exposed to stressors. And when it comes to women of color, the impact that it has on mental health changes, stress hormone epigenetics, so the immune system beginning to change and try to adapt to the amount of overactivation and stress. Ultimately, it's not just about the individual and their experiences, but the experiences in the second and the third generation, right? We wonder why, we have folks in our family who have a history of cardiovascular disease, right? They might be relatively healthy, they might eat relatively good food, but it can be these institutional stressors, and these traumatic events that have occurred through policy, things like migration, separating children from their families at the border, for instance, are really leaving a legacy for negative health outcomes. And we're really at the tip of the iceberg in terms of being able to understand what they are. There are structural stressors as well. And so this is one of my kind of favorite studies. This was a paper that was published in the Journal of the American Heart Association. So the Journal of the American Heart Association is typically reserved for cardiologists, individuals who are involved in cardiovascular interventions, etc. But it's not typically where you're going to find a lot of immunologists. It's not typically where you're going to find a lot of psychologists or neuroscientists for that matter. But this study really put all of it together. So in this study, what they did was they looked at individuals from a low socioeconomic background, and they looked at the extent to which they reported low income and high crime and neighborhood deprivation. What they found was individuals who reported higher levels of these socioeconomic stressors, there was greater activation in an area of the brain which is assigned with the perception of threat. It's called the amygdala. Many of you have probably heard about this brain region. So this subcortical brain region, which is firing off that alarm whenever there's a threat in the environment, shows greater activation in response to stress. You'll also see that there's greater activation in the bone marrow. So you have greater flow of immune cells out of the bone marrow. These immune cells, they found that they were associated with greater atherosclerotic development. And those individuals who had greater amygdala activity to stress, higher inflammatory immune activation, greater occlusion of those blood vessels, had greater risk for cardiovascular events. And so this is happening. This is kind of devoid. This study was done in a multiracial group. And so what it suggests that stressors, particularly socioeconomic stressors, can cut across race, can cut across ethnicity, and it can cut across gender to have an overall negative systemic effect on the body. Okay? Now, I'm probably beating the drum a lot, but I'll just close with this one in terms of the risk factors. There's environmental stress as well. One of the things in terms of mental health, and we most recently began a study where we are looking now at the gut microbiome and the experience of psychological stress. And what we're finding is that the gut, the food that we eat, not only contributes to our mental health, but the mental health, the psychological state and the stress that we're under can also contribute to a negative gut environment or gut dysbiosis, so to speak, okay? When it comes to foods, this is just a public service announcement to make sure that in terms of mental health and in terms of perceived psychological stress, we are ensuring that we consume foods that offer a wide range of microbial exposures, okay? Now, when you hear microbes and bacteria, people say, ew, right? And the biggest difference between food that is packaged in our grocery stores and the type of food that most of the rest of the world consumes is that the food that has been preserved and packed in these grocery stores is absolutely devoid of microbes, okay? Now, these bacteria that we stick up our nose and say ew to, just keep in mind that we evolved with bacteria. We have more DNA in our genome to code for the type of bacteria that's allowed to grow inside of us than telling us what our hair or eye color should look like. And the most important finding that we see over the last 10 years is that greater exposure to these old friends is associated with bacteria that have a lot of immunoregulatory properties, all right? And so these immunoregulatory properties, greater exposure to those is actually going to be associated to lower levels of acute psychological stress and acute stress-related immune activation. Okay. And so what are these foods I'm talking about? Really, I'm talking about raw foods, right? Now, if you can eat kimchi or drink some kombucha in place of your Sprite, or your Mountain Dew. Not that I'm ragging on those, but they're terrible. They're basically diabetic sugar water, right? If you can consume some of these more probiotic rich foods in your environment, spend more time in the fruit and vegetable sections of your grocery store, you'll find that you'll begin to develop greater resilience to psychological stress and the negative impact of stress on our body. Okay, now there's obviously many other ways that we can mitigate stress in our body. I'm going to move across because I know I'm running a little bit low on time, but some of the things that we find through research that have a really positive impact in terms of reducing stress, inflammation, and cardiovascular disease risk are mind-body interventions, okay? Now, what are mind-body interventions? Things like meditation, Tai Chi, yoga, hypnosis, paced breathing, body scanning. And what do all of these have in common? Even singing I can add to this list. But what these all have in common is that they activate the vagus nerve. Now, the vagus nerve essentially reflects when there is an increase in heart rate variability. Our heart typically becomes more variable when our breathing patterns tend to become more slowed down and relaxed. And when we are engaged in hypnosis and meditation, even singing, these things, choral singing, it's associated with increases in heart rate variability. There was a really phenomenal study, and it's been done and replicated years and years and years, but this was a group in the UK, and they had these mothers with postpartum depression that would come together and meet, and they'd simply sing. They'd sing songs, they'd hum, etc. And what they found was that the singing aspect of itself was the singing itself, and the singing intervention was able to reduce their depression and their postpartum depression. But the mechanism was not just experiencing happiness or being around another group of women, but the singing caused their heart rate variability to increase, right? So vagus nerve stimulation is something that's coming on, and it has a really potent anti-inflammatory effect when we do these types of things, particularly paced breathing. And what does paced breathing look like? A paced breath is a 10-second breath. So a 4-second inhale and a 6-second exhale. Try doing that 6 times, back to back to back, or even 3 or 4 times in a minute. And if you don't have a tingly sensation, or you don't feel just outright relaxed, then you might want to just check your pulse to make sure you have one. But these are some of the types of interventions that we find in the laboratory are having really stout effects on inflammatory outcomes in many different types of populations. So breathing exercises I mentioned right here. Inhalation and an exhalation is going to promote relaxation, reduce stress, relieve insomnia. Sleep is a major risk factor for mental health issues. So if you're getting poor sleep, a lot of this stuff you can just kind of throw it out in the wastewater, right? So we want to ensure that even if you're having trouble going to sleep at night, maybe engaging in some of these paced breathing techniques can help you reduce your anxiety. All right. And there's been lots and lots of work showing that this is going to increase your heart rate variability. More importantly, when you are not just in this paced, relaxed type of physiological state, but if you're in a positive mental, psychological state, such as appreciation. You've often heard the phrase, gratitude is an attitude. Simply expressing appreciation and compassion is associated with an increase in heart rate variability compared to expressing frustration, which is in a decrease in heart rate variability. So whether it be singing, reciting the Ave Maria, spontaneously breathing, engaging in other forms of meditation, we definitely find that the breath, as long as you tie these types of relaxation activities to the breath, you're going to be in relatively decent shape. And more than anything else, you're not going to hurt yourself, right? Breathing slowly. Then another public service announcement. In my field, we study MRI. So we literally look at the magnetic field that the brain gives off when you're thinking. Just to keep in mind that even though we're looking at these things inside the MRI scanner, the heart is about 100,000 times stronger electrically and 5,000 times stronger magnetically than the brain. Okay, so this sense of appreciation, heart math is what we sort of talk about it, definitely is something to keep in mind in terms of one's overall orientation towards others. Gratitude is the attitude. Along those lines, living a eudaimonic life tends to be associated with lower levels of cardiovascular disease risk and inflammation. And so there's a lot of work being done. One of my colleagues who works in University of California university system has shown that if you compare hedonic versus eudaimonic well-being, individuals who report eudaimonia are the ones that are going to have the greatest decrease in this conserved transcriptional response to adversity that I mentioned earlier on, right? Remember, that's when those immune cells begin ramping themselves up because the body thinks that you're at some type of threat exposure. Well, some of the work that has been presented suggests that individuals who live a eudaimonic life, meaning that it's all about helping other people, not about you being happy per se, but you helping others, is associated with a lower conserved transcriptional response to adversity. Importantly, if you have pro-social behavior that is towards the self or towards other people, it's not enough to reduce that conserved transcriptional response to adversity. You literally have to, towards the world, you literally have to be doing something for someone else, right? And that's going to be associated with, again, a decrease. And if you think about it, from an immune standpoint, from an evolutionary standpoint, we become very, very stressed when there's no type of resource available to us. If we're in a position where we can provide resources to other people, it's almost an evolutionary mechanism that it is not a stressful experience. It's almost a de-stressing experience. So again, something to think about from a pro-social standpoint. Getting out and about, right? So getting back to nature is very important. You've probably heard in the world of research, the blue space and green space. So just the way that we have this neighborhood deprivation index, and folks that are from environments that have, a lot of deprivation and a lot of crime, et cetera, are going to be associated with increased risk for cardiovascular disease. Putting yourself in green or blue space is going to be associated with decreased risk, okay? Now, maybe we don't have the parks that we need in our actual neighborhood, but there are state parks throughout the state of Florida, and I encourage you to take your family and go visit a state park in a weekend, right? Go hug a tree, go to the beach. You're going to be exposed. Not only is it going to be a relaxing environment, but you're going to be exposed to those old friends, those microbes in the air that are in the tree. In Japan, actually, it's actually quite fashionable these days that during the weekends, individuals go forest bathing, which means you leave the dense city, you go into the woods, and you simply walk around, inhale, and just be present. And this has been associated with buffering psychological stress and negative inflammatory immune and cardiovascular outcomes. Okay, so keep in mind green and blue space. There's also more work to suggest that this green and blue space is associated with lower gastrointestinal issues, such as inflammatory bowel disease. The last thing I'm going to mention here is religion and spirituality. All right. So when you look at some of the work that's been done comparing mental health outcomes between Black and white individuals, you'll find that despite individuals of color sort of having greater stress exposures, there's actually a greater, lower prevalence of depression across the board when you compare depression in Blacks versus whites, right? And so anytime we see this, there's oftentimes a Hispanic paradox. This is one of the few African-American paradoxes that we can find. And so we look at, well, what is it about African Americans in many cases that allows them to sort of subvert these stressors so that they don't develop into depression acutely? And so we've looked at religion and ethnicity, religion and spirituality, I should say. And what we find is that there are many mechanisms that allow for individuals who have a religious and spiritual background to buffer negative psychological stress. And so the research is really evident, and we actually did our own work where we looked at a measure of distress tolerance, and we compared that distress tolerance to individuals who have hope. And what we did was we compared how much hope they endorse versus how much religious and spiritual hope. And what we found that was in African Americans as well as Hispanics, so in non-Hispanic whites versus Hispanics and African Americans, endorsing religious and spiritual hope was associated with a decreased risk for this distress tolerance that I mentioned earlier on. And so again, what is hope? Hope is a universal feeling, the faith, the belief, and the possibility of positive outcomes. If you have this positive orientation, a eudaimonic well-being, and a willingness to help others, we find that it can not only help to reduce your cardiovascular risk factors, but help you move with intention and avoid these perceived stressors in one's environment. In layman's terms, if Stress is the perceived discrepancy between one's available resources and the actual environment. Well, if you call upon their supernatural, religious, or spiritual background, for many people, that is the ultimate resource. And so in those cases, they won't experience this perception of stress as an individual who doesn't endorse religion and spirituality to that degree. So with that, I just want to say that to keep in mind that we at the University of Miami are engaged in many different research projects. We are currently recruiting for 2 studies. One study is specifically examining women, specifically Hispanic or Latin American women who have been the victims of physical, sexual, and emotional trauma. And this is an expressive writing intervention where we are observing these physical outcomes as well as risk for cardiovascular disease, and to see if we can develop resilience in these individuals through an expressive writing intervention. There's also another study which we are currently recruiting for, which is individuals who have never been diagnosed with cardiovascular disease. And in this study, we're very, very interested in the daily experience of discrimination. So if you're someone who has experienced discrimination in your day-to-day life and would like to know a bit more about how this can perhaps affect negative cardiovascular health outcomes, go ahead and reach out to us either via that QR code or giving us a call at the lab.
Thank you, Dr. McIntosh. It was such an amazing presentation and so much information that some of the things we know, but some of the other things, when you kind of explain how everything works together, it's so useful.